and we're on the education fund. And so we have Julia Richter here from fiscal analyst, and also we have a new face from the 5th floor who's here to monitor our discussion. Do you want to introduce yourself, Anna?
Sure. Hi, my name is Emma Fedorchuk. I'm a budget analyst with the Department of Finance and Management.
So when did you start?
I actually started last year in about March, but we were all remote.
Oh yeah, I know.
I just wanted to confirm whether you had anything for the calendar tomorrow.
The budget adjustment? No, I'm just kidding. We don't have it.
You never know. You never know. Thank you.
All right. No, thanks for asking.
Yeah.
But no, we don't have anything. Thank you. All right. So one of our biggest areas of spending, of course, is K-12 and education fund, and what that looks like at this point. And I thought you could give us a little bit update, and know that you've been busy. Has the report come out? Is that on the web now, the income-based education financing?
Yes, so for the record, I'm Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. The committee report is published on JFO's webpage on the front featured publication.
Okay, that's good.
So I put together updated a slide deck about ed fund pressures, and I'm happy to go into any detail as the committee sees fit or talk about any questions you may have. I know that the committee is well versed in many of these topic areas. So I see that folks have the presentation in front of them. Yes. Oh, and great, thank you. And it's up there. So moving to the second slide, this is really just the education fund outlays and revenues over the past 10 years. So this is in nominal millions of dollars. And you can see that they're slightly increasing over time. The green chunk, that's those non-property tax revenues. So currently that includes things like the sales and use tax, meals and rooms, purchase and use. And we see the larger portion, historically about 66%, which is property tax revenues. The red line, that refers to the education fund uses. I think it's really interesting looking at this chart here. You can see, for instance, last year when there was or 2 years ago when there was that surplus, that was pretty historic. In the context of the education fund, it's represented by that little blip above the red bar in FY22. And then you see that while in FY23, while the red line, those education fund uses, is above the revenues that were raised, that was because those surplus dollars were in part used to make up that difference.
And how much money would that represent, do you know?
So the surplus?
In between the red line and the blue.
That's about $95 million.
That little bit.
That little bit. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's big money when you're talking about ed fund.
The education fund is roughly $2 billion. So.
It's bigger than the Mega Millions jackpot.
Oh, is that tonight?
I think so, yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know.
You buy a ticket for the state?
I need to go buy a ticket.
Yeah.
Maybe take the ed fund for my ticket.
Why don't you donate that $3 to me?
Julia, one of the things about property taxes, and that we have the two rates, residential and non-residential. How many towns now, the school spending has meant that the residential rate is higher than their non-residential?
That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. I'll have to get back to you.
I'm just wondering. I know originally no town, I don't think any town was, but now more and more based on school spending, residential has exceeded.
Higher.
Okay. So education fund, any questions on the graph? Otherwise we can go on.
Okay, so moving on to slide 3 here, education fund in the short and medium term. This is really just reminding the committee of things, the big picture education fund, so that pressures on the ed fund traditionally are addressed by property tax rates. Sometimes this is referred to as the flexible lever or an adjustable mechanism, where those property tax rates, the yields are set to make sure that the education fund is in balance.
Which it's totally unlike the state budget where we say, this is the amount you've got and you have to make it come in that amount. And like the governor says, give me a budget that has a 3%. So this is actually a parallel appropriations process that is determined by local voters who in the aggregate are really determining the property taxes, because that has to flow up at whatever rate is necessary to generate the total revenue necessary to support school budgets that have passed. So it's a unique area. It's a big area of the state budget, but it doesn't come through the appropriations process in the same way all the other functions of government that we would experience. So it is whatever the voters decide will drive that rate, and then we turn ourselves inside out trying to minimize that rate increase.
This particular year, if towns don't adjust their tax rate to follow the assessed rate, there's going to be a lot of extra money
You're
going.
talking about the CLA?
Yeah,
Because they're gonna be,
well, houses are appraised a lot higher, so if they don't adjust their tax rate,
the coefficient of dispersion
Yes.
is a real problem.
there's going to be a
Right,
problem.
Julia?
Yes.
People's taxes are going to go up, and we're going to get blamed for it, and there's no, that's
Well, what's
really
gonna
true.
happen is the current appraised values are gonna be substantially lower than the recent sales. And then you're going to get, there is that provision to prevent that from happening, because otherwise towns would have an incentive to underappraise property, or for current use, we had the reverse problem where towns wanted to over appraise value. Yeah, on the land. Yeah, that's right.
So where are we in the timing of that issue? Because there's the 3-year rolling average in this. It usually takes a year to 2 years for those numbers to hit the town. So you're really looking at a process that's probably 3 to 5 years before you calculate that in. So where in that?
That's a great question. I would have to defer to probably PBR. Their report is due to come out, and they would be able to talk in more expertise regarding the CLA and their calculation. It certainly is something that's come up. For instance, we saw in the December 1st letter that while the average tax rate was projected to decrease, in fact, the average tax liability was projected to increase when all of the additional surplus dollars were applied to lowering tax rates. So it's that discrepancy with, while the tax rate in fact may be lower, the tax liability or the tax bill may be higher.
Yeah, you're applying that percentage against a larger base.
Exactly.
So
That's value.
and that to me will be interesting because, we really aren't going to feel the full effect of this now. If the real estate run up from 20 and 21 into early 22, we probably aren't going to feel till calendar year like 25 or 6.
Yeah,
But then you're gonna run, it's gonna be, that's something finance
Yeah.
is already
Yeah.
concerned about is what has happened with the volatile and the extraordinary growth in sales. Because some of the sales people are paying more than the assessed value. And when you're looking at the assessment relative to those current sales, there's gonna be just such a disjuncture. And then the towns can get penalized because their appraisals are coming in significantly under what those current sales prices look like. So maybe there's some way of kind of trying to moderate that or something. Well,
In the income report, there's a suggestion to look at just requiring more townwide appraisals so they don't get out of sync so much.
Well, that's part of the reason why, was it last year? We tried to increase the per parcel amount. It came out of finance and we tried to do that, which would but the problem with that is now, you've got so many towns coming at the same time, and it's a limited number of people that do that work. So we're backed up on that side, so we might want to think about the penalty that hits the town when they reach that 80% mark.
well, that's what I'm thinking, that we've
We
got to
might,
do
we
something
might
maybe
want
to
to
mitigate
relieve
that.
that, not because there isn't the money to do it, but because they can't get anybody to do the work.
Yeah, I heard a town had to wait, if they called an appraiser company and said we can get to it in 7 years.
Right.
7 years, because that's how booked they were.
And if they're doing the work to get ready, why would we penalize them?
Well, that's gonna be a policy question that they're grappling with next door, because Ann made reference to it. Yeah.
Just have a question, Julie, when you said modestly above inflation, do you know what that is? Is it like 1%, 0.5%?
Not sure. But I can get back to you on that.
Yeah, I just wondered if it was under a percent or.
And what is modest?
Especially these days.
Here's something near and dear to us, and that's finally dealing with OPEB.
Yeah, so moving on to slide 4, we've compiled education policy and funding pressures on the horizon. They're in no particular order. They're really things that have been signaled by the General Assembly of interest or have already started to enter the ed fund. So we've got OPEB. It became a new ongoing cost in FY 2023, 15.1 million was appropriated, as I'm sure the committee recalls. The estimated cost for FY 2024 is 17.6 million.
On the other hand, some of that was balanced out by higher contributions on the pension side. So it was a whole package that was put together to deal with the fact that we had not put any pre-funding in. We had put a benefit in place. We were in a pay-go, which is absolutely the most expensive. And so last year's bill dealt with not only the pension underfunding, but the fact that when we put that healthcare cost in, it used to be paid out of the corpus of the retirement fund, which only compounded the underfunding of the teacher's retirement, and because it was a pay-go. And it was modest. It originally was like maybe 3 million, but as that cost continued, it didn't make sense. We had to deal with the fact that we had to start pre-funding so we can start getting investment returns and other ways of underwriting that cost for a benefit that we had implemented without really dealing with the financing. So the lesson to be learned anytime is if you create an obligation, going with it is you've got to deal with what is the ongoing cost. And the same was true for, for the decisions around the level of funding of the ADEC. So this was something that came out of that package, which was focused on pensions, but it's a post-retirement, and for all employees, their healthcare security is just as important as the amount of their pension. So this help was all part of that, looking at you're going to increase your contributions, and this is how we're going to start. This is how we're going to finally address, paying for your benefits. So this is new, and maybe it's a pressure on the horizon, but it was a pressure on state government in general.
Certainly, thank you. That's a really important nuance, that what is here is really solely talking about the education fund. So because I really focus on the education fund, this is only thinking about funding pressures or upcoming discussions with respect to the ed fund, and not how those fit into the bigger picture that this committee looks at.
And one other nuance, just to remember, part of that deal was the underfunding of the pension benefit is all out of the general fund. It's not on the ed fund. So it's not as though the general fund was simply, relieved of any of the costs, because the underfunding is a pretty substantial contribution. No, 120, I don't know how many million it is, a lot on the general fund.
Yeah, I would have to ask Chris Root, who's our.
Well, we're gonna do pensions.
Oh, okay, perfect. And so now on slide 5, this is universal school meals. So you'll recall in FY 2023, there was a one-time appropriation of 29 million for the funding of universal school meals, and it's due to sunset this coming year. JFO estimates currently that if the program is extended, it could cost up to 37 million going forward due to changes in participation and behaviors.
If I could just ask, Bobby, and I remember last session, you were saying you thought it was kind of an inflated number,
And I still believe that, and I've been told that we've got Rosie coming over this week, later Thursday, I think. But from what I've understood, it's costing this year, it's gonna run between 20 and 24 or 5 million. And last year, we were told there was gonna be 35, 40 million.
But this is actual, this is actual. You're saying now we know.
20 to 25 is what I've been told that it's actually gonna cost this year. And it isn't on what we had even projected for students. The number of students has increased by 16% that are taking hot lunch. So there's 16% more kids eating, and the cost is lower than what we were told last year.
But I thought their estimate was based on universal.
Yeah, so the $29 million estimate was based on limited data that we had available to us. We didn't know how many students were going to start eating, and we didn't know, so the cost of universal meals really depends on 2 primary factors. One is participation, how many kids are eating, and the other is how many families are filling out paperwork to draw down those federal dollars. So we had to look, and we worked with the administration, with Rosie Kruger, to reach a consensus estimate of 29 million, where we said, okay, let's assume that there's average participation rates, and let's assume that 30% of families are pulling down those funds, eligible families. So with AOE, they're due to come back January 15th with a report on universal meals, participation rates.
Preliminary report, didn't we?
There was the task force for universal
Okay,
meals,
that's what I'm thinking.
but they're due to come back with an update on universal meals. And with that update, hopefully we have better data, so we can use that data to update the estimate. So based on our best estimate, it was 29 million. And so that was what was appropriated out of the education fund last year to fund the universal meals. So there is the report due from AOE by January 15th. And then JFO has a report also to examine potential revenue sources to fund universal school meals. And that's due on February 1st. And those are sources, we're supposed to look at sources that are not ordinarily used for the general fund.
So,
Oh,
if I could,
and then-
so I'm not remembering the specific language, but when it says JFO report with possible revenue sources, were those revenue sources suggested in the language that was put into the budget, or were those things that JFO developed on their own?
In the language, the universal school meals bill language,
It listed some.
it listed, I think, several potential options and then said something like, and other revenue sources.
Mhm.
So it's a report from JFO looking at those options that were laid out in the language and then potentially other options as well.
I have a feeling some of those options are on multiple lists to fund different
Yeah.
initiatives, so.
I
think we got ourselves in
Unhappy,
trouble.
right, where it's coming.
Wishes. Well,
Well,
Yeah.
but they're sort of promises.
Yeah.
I
so,
was interested, in New York legislature was touting Vermont funding universal school meals, and they should too. What they didn't say, or didn't probably know, was we only did it for one time appropriation, and we'll be scrambling to cover that and all the other needs that we have, particularly childcare.
But I wouldn't support getting everything in place other than right where it's coming. So I think
Right.
that's a good spot.
With
The question is-
pressures.
what is that ed fund gonna look like in terms of tax rates? Because and I noticed it's in kind of at the end, and that's part of what we know is out there, and that is the PCB remediation, which carries millions of dollars, and then the inventory of schools and the conditions and deferred maintenance. And my little town thinks they should have a new school to the tune of $77 million. I know. Yes. And we have no structure at this point to evaluate construction, the extent to which, because right now, the funding for it is really on the ed fund. And so between the PCBs and then what this inventory shows relative to the deferred maintenance and the condition of some of the schools, which we've heard are really bad, like the sewer systems back up, the water systems, the wiring hasn't been updated since the 50s. We've got millions and millions of dollars of pent up costs on construction, depending on what we put for reviews and parameters and what that process will be. Now, the new treasurer has suggested that we should do like Massachusetts and say, we have 3 versions of a new school or an addition in terms, so you're not paying an architect, every single time. And then you have these standard designs that you can be used as a way of reducing costs, because obviously there are fiscal incentives to make it based on square footage or based on total cost. So but right now we have nothing. So it's kind of it's going to be huge. I do believe when we get the price tag for that
But
collectively.
When the income study was done, was there any analysis of a number of kids who might, or parents who might be willing to pay for school lunches? And then the whole set of kids who receive federal dollars? Was there any breakdown based on income levels for kids requiring for school meal support?
And I think we've kind of gotten out of sequence because Andy had a question and
Yeah, well,
so I don't know, Phil, you've done.
Oh, no, I'm fine.
I just want to be respectful of the order of things. Are you on school lunches or?
I still, let's go on, the 37 million, so that's a new estimate for this year, but without the knowledge of these reports about how many, the main thing I remember from last year was how many families are going to fill out this universal income form that we hoped everybody would do, because that would allow us to draw down a lot more federal funds.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. The 37 million is not necessarily referring to this coming year. That's sort of an upper bound moving forward. Thinking about, down the line when it just becomes more of a norm where parents no longer think to pack school lunches because they know those participation changes. That's really where that 37 million is getting at. It's not talking about FY24.
And not talking about the federal, no estimate about the drawdown of federal funds, or is that include what you think would be?
That's assuming that the drawdown of federal funds will lessen over time.
All right, well, we'll keep going because there are a lot of dings on this cash register here. Yeah,
Go ahead and talk about what I'm gonna bring up later.
well, universal benefits usually come with a big price tag because you're feeding all kids. You're not feeding the kids whose families' income are. If you want to talk about families, kids who are at risk of hunger, it's probably our reach up families.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what a single mother with 2 kids get, $800 a month total. And that's to pay the rent, to buy their clothes, to feed them, the whole thing. So, I will tell you from my personal experience, if you're looking at children who are at risk of hunger, it would be those families that are well below the poverty line. They're already in universe, but they're the ones that get the backpacks at home, and the families are having to rely on charitable food system because you can't. You gotta supplement whatever that benefit. And Ginny, I know we increased it some, but for a family of 3, I don't think it's still under 900 a month.
But you would think it would encourage the mother to try to find some employment.
Well,
You wouldn't
there are
have a very good job there anymore.
there are
$800.
incentives in the reach up to work, but a significant number of those families, a parent might have a disability and can't work, or their children have a disability and have to stay home. And that's why the one thing that we did last year, and it came in a tax bill, and that was to increase the AABD supplement to the SSI benefit. And it had been so long, I asked a number of advocates, do you know what the AABD program is? And they didn't have a clue. And it was one of our basic safety net programs for people who are elderly or with disabled, or for children. So if you can work, you can get some disregards and stuff, and we increase the disregards, but it's still, relatively speaking, a very modest amount relative to the cost of housing. So unless you got subsidized housing, that would be the big variable.
That's the other thing, yeah.
So shall we go on to our next one, PCBs?
So moving on to slide 6, PCBs in schools. You may recall that 32 million was reserved last year in the education fund for remediation and mitigation in schools. In October 2022, the E-Board released 2.5 million of those 32 for to support immediate action on PCB exposure remediation.
And Cabot was one of the first.
So that money was approved in July 1, and none of it got released until October.
Well, they had to go through the testing to determine that they had PCBs present and where they were located and the extent to which they could work around them. So if it was like an area where kids weren't, or you didn't need to use a classroom. So it took a little bit of time and then the Department of Education and the Agency of Administration had to make the request. And the E-Board approved it, but there was some lag between testing, and then there was a change, I think, in the standards, because what happened in Cabot is they used a different standard, and it was much more aggressive in terms of what they had to do. But by that point, the information had gone out to families, and there was no rolling it back. But I think the subsequent standards or whatever did produce a different kind of finding about the risk. But I guess the Burlington School is the biggest example
A huge,
of huge,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, so they approved a bond of 165 million.
What's the debt service on that? It makes our capital bill look like,
Maybe.
Yeah,
I have to check, I don't have it up in front of me.
Been voted.
But, and I will say, with respect to this PCB reserve, the 29.5 million that remains, it's the dollars are reserved, but the allocation of those dollars is still to be determined.
It has to be approved by the emergency board or the legislature.
but
well,
yeah,
the release of the
General Assembly.
2.5 was e-board, but the
Right.
balance is, and it's to give some
So
parameters, so,
that's carried.
that's the big problem is, is the timing issue, so if you test and, one school gets in the gate first, but something gets tested later and the 31 million is gone, they get nothing even though maybe their test results indicated a much higher risk, so it's kind of complicated in terms of the release of that money in the
So will that happen in the budget or in the policy committee or we?
I think it'll have to happen probably in the budget.
Budget.
Do you know whether, and maybe what federal grants are possible for PCB remediation? Does the EPA have anything?
I don't know.
I mean, because this is not just in Vermont, obviously, it's across the country. And is the federal, we'll talk about current Congress, but has the federal government made any steps or has our?
Like they did for brownfields.
Yeah, similar. There's something, a revolving loan fund or anything that would help. Maybe you could see if there's anything there through our congressional delegates.
Sure.
Yeah,
Because we can't afford this. We cannot afford any of that. Oh, period.
well, yeah, but there's something wrong with,
I mean, I want to. The most important thing.
I think there's something wrong with these numbers, like even in Burlington. When you think about them spending $168 million to build a high school, JP just sold this fall 3 big, beautiful hotels, a water park, a skate rink, a golf course. I don't even know how many lifts for 77 million. And they had a hard time getting that for that.
They must anticipate global warming.
And-
No,
That's why they have the water.
that's why they have the water park and the golf course, yeah.
No, I mean, it's crazy,
But
these
the
numbers
design-
that,
The whole design, engineering, remediation of any of the soil that's there, and then you have and then new construction, it's really expensive. They went through the mill
but
with that.
$1 million is
Yeah.
still a lot of money, even though it isn't anything like what it used to be.
You're right.
You know, you have
The
to
cost
work to
of-
spend $1 million.
Except any entity that is adding on is discovering tremendous additional costs because of workforce and material costs. So the little library in Hardwick, the armory at St. Jay,
I gotta say, when you give the number for the school replacement Danville, the size of Danville versus Burlington, that Burlington looked cheap.
What was Danville?
the original plan was 77 million.
Oh, yeah.
400 students or something. No, I'm just saying,
They're not
that-
in thousands of students, they're 400.
so that
part of the
gets into the whole issue, and that has to do with what we're gonna do in terms of financial participation and what parameters you put around the spending, because it basically, once it's voted, it's gonna pop out onto everybody's property taxes.
$800 at an average home in Burlington, they said.
Or it also affects the statewide.
But it also affects everybody else too.
Yes.
Yeah, don't think that the.
So we should all get to vote on that.
Danville,
Well, for 77 million, I think, yeah, we should all
Well,
get.
that gets back
Remember
into my
back-
earlier comment about it's a parallel appropriations process. And revenue raising, basically, we set the rate to generate whatever amounts voted on, so all of this it's gonna influence the cost of the K through 12, so let's keep going on to page 7 here.
So page 7, we have childcare and pre-K funding and structure. So I'm sure you're aware, JFO contracted with the RAND Corporation to complete a childcare and early education financing report. That report is due to be released on the 17th of January. So as of now, the total cost and other details are not yet known. And the General Assembly will determine how to move forward or if to move forward with respect to the funding source and design of a potential future program.
The issue with this one, of course, is that there will be transitional periods so that regardless of how much the highest amount is, that doesn't mean it is committed or expended in the first year. It means that there's decision-making about what happens in that first year and limits can be placed on any expansion. So,
Well, that's true, when you do things incrementally, you can afford the next increment.
exactly, so if that's
There,
part of the
but,
planning, it'll be so important.
But that's where we also need to remember, this committee will get it, and that's an updated list of the various commitments we already have and where what we're underfunding already. And the best example is, we talk about housing, and we have not withstood the full transfer to VHCB for years. And that's a commitment that we're not doing. And a number of years ago, Gus Seelig was looking at, just within one administration, would have brought maybe 1,000 more housing units online, which were obviously not brought online because of the notwithstanding and the full transfer was not made. So when you're looking at where your first dollar goes, and that's what I'm always saying, this is what this committee is going to have to look at, is where does that first dollar go? It doesn't mean that something isn't of value or it doesn't have merit, but what do we have for commitments now? And how well are we doing? And if you're going to raise revenues, then would you put that new benefit or service? How does that stack up with what you've already committed to, and how well are you doing? Or do you want to say, we're gonna not fund that program or that benefit anymore? So it's welcome to the world of appropriations.
You mean there's limited resources?
Yes, you only have to look at it. So, for example, the REACH program, the last I knew, if we were to pay, the full standard of need based on the old methodology, which probably needs to be redone, it's over a $20 million price tag to increase the benefits to families with children. So that's on the underfunding. Some of the other, of course, would be the pensions use is on that list. And we'll get a report that outlines it, because it gives you some sense of, well, how well are we doing? What are we already committed to? Do we want to honor those commitments? Do we want to say we're going to jettison some? Or do we continue to say it's really desirable, we wish we could do more, but we can't? That's the world of money. It's not anything new.
No, I have a question.
You may ask your question.
So with the study, it includes pre-K. In this, I assume, if I remember correctly, pre-K, we're talking about like the finance assistance program? Because the pre-K is not part of,
It's not part of that.
CTFAP.
so it's just the CFA money. When
No,
they talk about funding.
No.
No, they're talking about
She's the expert.
Yeah.
They're looking at pre-K education. so not just CCFAP.
And some schools have 10 hours, some schools have full-time, so there's some variability around the
They're
state.
It's just a
required to
public-
provide at
a
least
public
10
briefing.
hours. Mhm.
If they provided it, I thought some did.
Well, they can then tuition out
Right.
to another provider.
The original
Right.
study was to look at childcare and CCFAP and transition to have income levels covered so that there would be reduced co-pays and increased appropriations and resources depending on your income. I don't think the original study had a segregation of pre-K that we asked for, but there's been discussion about that.
And there's been some discussion about fourth graders and full-time, and there are all kinds of proposals that would add more costs. And usually the governor has one, including the move of the community high school in Vermont to the ed fund, so we probably could expect that again. Is that on your list?
It's not on my list. Although, next on my list is CTEs. So this is the CTE funding and structure. So there's also a study out, JFO's contracted with APA to conduct a study and issue a report on CTE governance and structure. That's due on March 1st of this year. And like with childcare and pre-K, it's up to the legislature to determine if the structure should be changed, and if so, what should the changes be to the funding source. There's also the one-time 15 million appropriation from FY 2023 to VHCB for the revolving loan program to connect the CTE building trades and housing needs. And then moving on to slide 9, school construction. As mentioned by Chair Kitchell, there was the Vermont School Facilities Inventory and Assessment that came out in April 2022. And then AOE is required to provide a school facilities and infrastructure assessment update in 2023. And so once again, those next steps, what they should be, are to be determined by the legislature. Lastly, or let's say last in this slide deck, on slide 10, we've got cannabis revenues for certain programs. So the session law regarding cannabis stated that the sales tax was to be used to fund a grant program to start or expand after school and summer learning programs. But the details around the specifics and the appropriations are yet to be determined. So that's just another outstanding thing on our radar. Which really wraps up my presentation to slide 11, just reminding the committee that pressures are traditionally addressed by property tax rates, which is the conversation that keeps coming up. It's very different than the other funds. And there's a lot of different funding pressures and policy decisions with varying levels of certainty and scope.
Back to my preschool question. So that those pre-K expenses are all part of the school budget that's voted on by the school board.
Yes.
And then included in the various education appropriations that we, which we just accept. They don't alter, they're not subject to rescind. For example. Yes, Bobby.
On the cannabis revenues, I thought I heard a report maybe a week ago on the news that it had generated 325,000 in excise taxes. Did anybody hear anything
I think that was
about
like
that?
the first.
When we have the vet in, they will be doing some projections on that revenue source, so that's gonna be next year.
Yeah, I would defer to them or to colleagues Emily Byrne and Ted Burnett, who focus on cannabis in our office.
And I don't know if we get those taxes, if they go somewhere else. So excise tax. So,
Oh, we got
And while the sales tax all goes into
Well, yeah. it's-
that, right? Sales
No,
tax.
go ahead.
Right, and it has this provision that it should be used for after school and summer learning.
6% part.
Yes, the sales tax, because there's two taxes, excise, and the excise portion goes to prevention, I believe.
Yes, right.
Which part was supposed to come back to us to pay off
Well, there is the
2
opportunity
million
this,
or 3 million? We-
I think this year they're
Oh.
looking at the taxes.
We paid that. Originally, we were advancing it and gonna get repaid, but we used one-time money because we figured there wasn't gonna be enough to pay us back. So Stephanie's not here, but that's my recollection,
Yeah,
that we decided that we would meet those upfront costs and not advance it, just we would use one time.
Sounds like, though, they're doing well with their sales.
Well, we'll see. Next week, we'll see what the projection looks like for next year and this year as well. I mean, there's been, I know, Phil, you've talked about a portion of the revenue would go to support our state college system, for example.
Yeah.
The more we carve up things and the more we dedicate it, the more difficult it makes to do a budget, or you're subjected to notwithstanding or whatever. So we'll see.
Which sports betting?
And this committee actually has supported sports
Yeah.
betting.
I would support that
Yeah.
again. Do you have
And
a bill or is it already in?
Well,
I'd sign on.
Senator Ron Midsdale and I, and we're on the sports betting committee, and there'll be a bill based on the recommendations, but you still have members of the House who are in powerful positions.
Well, when
that
it
don't
comes
see
time,
it.
I'd like to sign on.
They get short enough on money.
As long as there's prevention.
Promote.
Yeah, I don't know, I mean,
Pretty aggressive.
well,
They're already sports betting. They're already doing it.
well, you just gotta go over the border.
Well, other questions of Julia before we go on to a
How do you
different
feel
topic?
about sports?
I will say no on that.
All right, well, we have, some of us have another meeting at 4. It's gonna be in this room, so why don't we call it a day?